This evening, I just want to talk a little bit about the Electoral College. It's an issue that's been in the news because we're coming up on another presidential election. And we always see at various times people calling for the end of the Electoral College. And sometimes we just think that it's just a system to elect the president, which it is, but it's also a part of our constitutional heritage. And I'm hoping to explain some of that. Just a couple of political cartoons that get in. Of course, this is Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's one of the 20-some candidates running for the Democratic nomination. She has also called to get rid of the Electoral College. Here in this cartoon, she says we need to get rid of the Electoral College so that the president will be chosen by the big blue states. And I'll explain more about what that means, but basically, if we had a direct national popular vote, you would see basically the coasts, big cities, picking who would be our next president, which may seem more democratic, but it really isn't. Here's another one. You may have been familiar with the college admissions scandal. Here's a Democratic donkey, abolish Electoral College, and a Hollywood liberal saying, can't we just pay off its admissions office? And that's really because the Electoral College is one of the most misunderstood aspects of our constitutional system. It really is. A recent NBC Wall Street Journal poll basically came out that said 53% of Americans favor a national popular vote. And one of the reasons for that is that advocates who want to abolish the Electoral College say, well, it's more democratic. And we hear the term democracy constantly in our political discourse. And of course, we know that our system of government is a republic, not a democracy, but we sort of use those terms interchangeably. So just some background on the Electoral College. It's defined in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, so if you want to look at that. And basically what it does is the Electoral College is simply a group of representatives or electors chosen in each state to cast official ballots for President of the United States. So think of it this way. You basically have 50 separate elections going on. And you know, Iowa has their method of running elections, Nebraska has theirs, South Dakota, and so forth. And so you basically have, if you count the District of Columbia, which isn't a state, so you have 51 separate elections for president. Now, the Constitution mandates that each state get as many electors that it has members of the U.S. House and Senate. I'm not very good at math, so I like to use Wyoming as an example because each state gets 2 senators. Wyoming has 1 rep, so they have 3 electoral votes. And that's how that is decided. I'll explain more about that. The other thing is political parties nominate electors who will promise that they'll cast electoral votes for that specific party's presidential candidate. Now, this varies state by state. In Iowa, our electors are selected by political parties. Some states, basically, they have a provision in state law that says that that elector has to be bound, meaning that if they're chosen, they can't say, I'm going to cast my ballot for Donald Trump and then change their mind at the last minute. Now, that has happened. It's called a faithless elector, but it's very rare. It's only happened, I think, over 90%, 99%, I think. It's a very high percent where electors are faithful when they cast their ballots. So in these elections, as you know, and as the young man stated, basically it's based on winner take all. So when an individual votes, when you cast your ballot, you will see the names of the candidate there that you're voting for, but you're actually voting for that party's electors. So in a certain extent, it is a popular election. So 48 states award, as well as the District of Columbia, award their entire slate of electors on a winner-take-all basis. So, you know, whoever wins majority in Iowa wins Iowa's electoral votes. Maine and Nebraska are the exception. They allocate them proportionally based on their congressional district results. And again, states have that leeway. The Constitution allows states that broad interpretation. So you have in total 538 electoral votes. The magic number is 270. You'll hear that quite a bit. You know, the great horse race of presidential politics. Who's going to get 270? Well, after the election, when we know who the winner of the vote is, and I'll go through one example where we did have a divided election that resulted in going to the House of Representatives, but basically, and this is an important point, in December, the first Monday after the second Wednesday, the electoral ballots are cast in state capitals. Again, this is because states matter. The Constitution did not basically grant all powers to the federal government. It left states sovereign in many areas. And one area is in the Electoral College. So there is a few occasions where if no candidate obtains a majority, the election then goes to Congress, and that has only happened a few times. The most famous is 1824, and this is a very divided election. I think I've got a map here. So this, believe it or not, all these candidates were running on the same party ticket. This is before what we'd call a two-party system comes into play. And you had John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Crawford, and Henry Clay. All these candidates were basically what we'd call sectional regional candidates, and so no one got a majority, and the House of Representatives decided. Eventually, the House voted. Each state gets one vote in that process, and John Quincy Adams got that election. Interesting enough, it was Andrew Jackson, the first Democrat president, who called for the abolition of the Electoral College because he said a corrupt bargain had taken place in 1824. He said that Quincy Adams and Henry Clay joined together in a conspiracy that's not necessarily true. They were more allied politically than they were with Jackson. So that's just one example. Also in 1800, another unique election. Believe it or not, prior to the 12th Amendment, the winner of the vote became president and the runner-up became the vice president. So you had John Adams, our second president, winning the election of 1796. His vice president was Thomas Jefferson, his bitter enemy. It'd be just like today if Hillary Clinton was vice president under President Trump. Can you imagine that? It'd be probably pretty interesting. So we get the 12th Amendment now because it basically now allows the top two candidates to become president and vice president. The 12th Amendment sort of clarifies that process. And in the 1800 election, you had confusion because the top two vote getters were from the same party, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr, if you know anything about him from American history, was very radical, much of a character. And even the Federalists, the party of Alexander Hamilton, said, we'd rather have Jefferson than Burr. So the 12th Amendment clarifies that process. Let's get into the Constitution a little bit, because basically when we look at this, it's based on, the Constitution is based on a series of compromises. And I'm going to simplify this a little bit, because one of the big factors at the Constitutional Convention that met in Philadelphia of 1787 was the issue of large versus small states. And this becomes very important when we look at the Electoral College. Small states feared that larger states would overpower them. And one of the big debates at the convention was over the idea of representation. Who would have more representation under this new government? Larger states wanted basically to have representation based on population. Smaller states wanted more equal. And so what you get is what they call the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise that hammers out the system we have today. The House of Representatives is based on population, whereas the Senate has, everyone is treated equal. Each state gets 2 senators. Now, one of the more difficult decisions came with how do we elect the president? And this was a major issue of concern. First of all, I want to point out that the Founding Fathers basically were suspicious of democracy. These were individuals who came to Philadelphia that were steeped in political tradition. They had studied past governments, England. They looked at the governments of Europe and Greece and things like that. And so they understood different systems. They were also afraid that if the president was elected on a direct popular vote, it would not only create what they would consider mob rule, but they also feared if the legislature had control of it, the president would become subject to the legislature, which would then violate the key principles of checks and balances and separation of powers. So just like that compromise over representation, we see the Electoral College is something similar. Because keep in mind, the states still factor within the Constitution. You know, the federal government is one of few and defined powers, or it's supposed to be. And so what we see now is, with the Electoral College, concessions are made. One example of this is the 17th Amendment. Does anybody know what the 17th Amendment did?
Gave popular votes to senators.
Yes, yeah. The state legislatures were in control of who would serve as United States senators. And so that was one way where states could check the federal government. That has changed now because of the 17th Amendment. But what we get through the Electoral College is not a national referendum, but where the states now have a role in it, because it also protects smaller states in electing the president. Because if we could go back in time after the ratification of the Constitution, the two bigger states were Virginia and New York. They wouldn't necessarily be controlling who would be president. And in places like Rhode Island were very concerned, smaller states were very concerned that they would be shut out of who would be the president. So we need to keep in mind that the Constitution was designed basically to keep states sovereign. And as I point out here in the last point, the sovereign states voted. It wasn't a national referendum to approve the Constitution. It happened state by state. So here's just a quote, it's probably hard to read, but from one of Heritage Foundation's legal scholars, but basically explains that Electoral College is about federalism. And he says the basic principles of federalism, the principle upon which this nation was founded, were used to design the United States election process. As a result, federal elections are decentralized affairs. Each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia run their own elections on the first Tuesday of November every 4 years. And so basically, that is a key point. Another one from Alan Gilzo, a historian, he says abolishing Electoral College might basically try to achieve that idea of direct democracy, but basically then there's no sense of having the United States Senate either. Because basically, think about it, the Senate is not a democratic institution either. For example, remember how controversial the Kavanaugh hearings were for the Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh? Liberals were upset because they said, why should two senators from Wyoming be able to have greater power, just the same power as two senators from California? In fact, the late Representative John Dingell of Michigan even talked about how the Senate should be abolished, that we should just have one unicameral legislative body based on population. And if you think of our constitutional structures of checks and balances and separation of powers, what do you think might happen if we just had one unicameral legislature? I'm sorry?
The coasts will win.
Exactly right. You would basically have what founders would call tyranny of the majority. And so keep in mind that as well, is that the Electoral College preserves the rights of what we call political minorities. Majority still wins, but minority rights are protected in our constitutional system. So what are some of the main arguments against Electoral College? Of course, the first is that they say it's not only obsolete, but it's undemocratic. And the rallying cry is one man, one vote. And they'll say, well, my vote actually doesn't count under the Electoral College. Well, first of all, the idea of one man, one vote is not in the Constitution. It comes from a Supreme Court case in 1963, Gray versus Sanders, and then it's brought up among other cases later on. And basically what's now underway is something called the National Popular Vote movement that's making this case. That Electoral College is not only obsolete, it's undemocratic because people's votes aren't counting. And so what they want to do now is basically pass laws at the state level to tie their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. So let's just use an example. Iowa, Donald Trump won Iowa. And so if Iowa had passed national popular vote and it was enough states had joined this compact, then regardless of the people of Iowa's decision for preference, the majority for Donald Trump, we would have to go with the winner of the national popular vote in 2016. And who won the popular vote in 2016? Hillary Clinton did, yeah. So you can see what's going on here. Right now, 15 states, and I believe all these are blue states or heavily Democratic states, have passed national popular vote legislation. Jake and I were just talking beforehand, Nevada, we might have the 16th state, Nevada, has just recently passed. I don't know, has the governor signed that or?
I don't think so.
Okay. Right now they're at 189 electoral votes. That means the states that have committed to this process. So this is kind of scary because in a way it's, I would say, kind of undermining the Electoral College. And I imagine if they do reach the magic number of 270, there would be some legal challenges to that based on the states and interstate compacts. So we need to keep in mind that every vote does count, and this is done by a state-by-state basis. That's why I'm saying it's important to consider that the Electoral College is part of this larger idea of federalism within our Constitution. Again, remember that the elections take place in each state. And when we're voting for electors, even though we're selecting the presidential candidate of our choice. So people's votes are being counted. I can understand that some people get frustrated and think because their candidate didn't win, then their vote isn't counted. I lived in an area where a Republican was lucky to get 40% of the vote. But if you're a Republican in that atmosphere, you don't feel too well on election night. Or vice versa, if you're a Democrat in a very conservative area, you don't really feel like your vote's being treated fairly if you're not winning. But that's the nature of our system. You know, it could be worse. We could be like Europe and then have all kinds of political parties, which I don't think is a very good system. So one point is that the Electoral College provides a certain checks and balances and protects minority rights from majority rule. Because basically, under a direct national popular vote, you would have candidates focusing on one constituency, people in urban areas. Do you think presidential candidates would come to Iowa under a direct national vote? No. We would be what they call flyover country. Now, because of that, because Electoral College, people running for president have to build coalitions. They have to build national coalitions in order to win, and I'll go through that here in a bit. The other argument is this, and we see this with the Constitution as well, is that, well, Electoral College was only designed to protect slavery. Now, we know one of the controversial things of the American founding was the institution of slavery. And we could have a whole nother evening just talking about the slavery in the Constitution, so I don't have time to go into all that detail, but at the time, there's a great compromise where you're probably familiar, where slaves would be counted as 3/5 toward representation. That was also a debate within the Constitutional Convention. Northern delegates did not want slaves counted towards population. Southerners did. They wanted them counted as one person for purposes of representation because they could get more people in the U.S. House. Well, the compromise was they'd be counted as 3/5. But we need to keep in mind that in 1787 through 1788, slavery was in every state. Obviously, it was more dominant in the South. And it also did not give slave-holding states an advantage. Virginia's population, I put there as an example, would still be one of the larger states, even if you didn't have the 3/5 clause. And the Electoral College made no difference in deciding the presidency during the 36 years before the Civil War. In fact, the winner in 1824, that close election, I went to the House, was John Quincy Adams, who was an abolitionist. John Quincy Adams was opposed to slavery versus his prime opponent, Andrew Jackson. And of course, the election of 1860, we had tremendous division, obviously right on the eve of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was only on the ballot in northern states and won the electoral vote. And of course, when Lincoln won, then that triggered southern states to start leaving. So the question is, why preserve the Electoral College? You know, a very simple answer is because it works. I mean, when you take an objective look at it through history, the system works. We've had some close elections, but in the end, those elections are always decided. It's also constitutional. It fits within the framework of what the founders designed. Our Constitution provides a system, federalism, means that, again, there's a role for the states within our constitutional government. There's checks and balances between the three branches of government, and there's separation of powers. And as I said, I would argue that national popular vote, the direct popular vote, would actually make things more, would actually limit the votes of people. Because again, it would basically focus on certain large-scale constituencies. And small states would certainly lose out. Just like, as I said, if we got rid of the Senate, it would be a similar impact. The Electoral College also forces candidates to campaign nationally and build coalitions. This also brings moderation and stability. Also, the other thing is, and we don't know the impact, but if you had one universal vote, I may remember the 2000 election, Bush v. Gore. Yeah. Just imagine all the recounts that would happen under a direct national popular vote. It would be Florida times 1,000. That's not a good situation. And I want to give some quick examples here through history of what happens when candidates are forced to build these coalitions. First is Franklin Roosevelt, 1936. He originally was elected in 1932, defeated Herbert Hoover in a landslide. Roosevelt created a powerful coalition that basically empowered the Democratic Party for much of the 20th century. 1936, this solidified his landslide. Roosevelt is in the red here, and you can see his Republican opponent, Alf Landon, who was nicknamed the Kansas Coolidge, only won 2 states. And the reason for that, obviously, was we're still in the Depression, which made Roosevelt very popular. But Roosevelt was also to build a massive coalition. The New Deal coalition included farmers, urban folks, minorities, Southern Democrats. It was this broad coalition, the labor movement, that Roosevelt was able to tie together into this massive political coalition. The next example is Richard Nixon, 1968. This is the first time the Republicans break Roosevelt's New Deal coalition. Nixon is able, because of turmoil from Vietnam, Nixon is able to basically start getting southern states to move into the Republican camp, as well as attract what we call blue-collar manufacturing workers from the Midwest and Northeast. In 1972, look what Nixon does. He gets a landslide. Poor George McGovern doesn't have a chance. And this obviously doesn't last because of Watergate, that turns the tables on the Republicans. But Reagan comes back and does something similar. Ronald Reagan, 1980, sort of builds a new coalition of Southerners, of blue-collar workers, of a whole different group, even farmers, and basically by 84, look at. So this is the process of having to build these coalitions under a presidential campaign. And we saw this in the last election. This is 2016, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. What did Trump do in that election in terms of this map to build a coalition?
The American manufacturer.
Exactly right. Trump did something that no one really thought was impossible, is he sort of almost resurrected that Nixon-Reagan coalition. He attracted blue-collar workers, manufacturing workers, a lot of labor vote, as well farmers, and he broke the famous blue wall that the Democrats had. He won places like Iowa, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania. These are swing states. And we probably wouldn't have swing states if we had a direct national popular vote. Because again, in a sense, the larger population areas, the larger cities would be controlling the results of the election. Now, it'll be interesting to see in 2020, will this coalition that President Trump built hold together? But he has built an impressive national coalition based on his issues. Now, what we also see is that he won the electoral vote. As I said, Clinton won the popular vote. But this is again where smaller states are having their voices heard. This is a perfect example of smaller states having their voices heard in this election. So why preserve it? So as I said, it provides stability and certainty. It forces competition in our elections. You know, we would have these swing states. Iowa is am I right to say Iowa's a purple state, kind of a swing state? Yeah, so Iowa is a swing state. Pennsylvania, the president was there on Tuesday, I think, he held a rally there. I mean, Pennsylvania or Florida, these are swing states. Going back to the Senate, the Electoral College also is similar to the Senate where it protects small states. Small states have a voice in the Senate. California has, what, 54, 56, 58 representatives to the U.S. House. Our friends in Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, they just have one. So just imagine if we didn't have that Senate again. So it doesn't create an equal situation. So when you have the two senators, that provides balance for small states. In addition, also some of our other elements of the Constitution are not democratic either. A president can veto a bill passed by the majority of elected representatives. Now, the legislature can override that, of course. Federal judges can strike down laws. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt campaigned as a bull moose progressive, bolted the Republican Party, and Roosevelt argued that people should have a right to have a national referendum on court cases. It can be dangerous. The problem with democracy is, I hope I don't offend anybody when I say this, but just imagine if a strong gun control bill is passed that undermines the Second Amendment, and people had the right to either approve or disapprove that through a national referendum. Democracy can go either way, and that's what the founders were trying to protect against. And so, in our system, you know, the founding fathers wanted to make sure that tyranny of the majority does not happen. Finally, this is just a quote from an op-ed I wrote recently that, you know, as I mentioned, this debate is not new. But I'm afraid that the majority of these Democrats running have made statements, and Jacob has pointed this out as well, favoring the abolition of the Electoral College. And this, I believe, will be detrimental for our republic if that happens. Because, as I mentioned, this is not just about electing the president, it's about our constitutional system. Limited government, federalism, equal representation, and separation of powers, those were the unique mechanisms that made our Constitution. Is it perfect? No, but the Founding Fathers never said that we created a perfect system. They understood human nature was flawed. But we have a system that works very well. And we need to be aware of this issue. Is there any questions? I hope I didn't speak too long, but any questions or comments? Yes, sir.